a girl. And yes, our little girl is looking more and more like Winston Churchill every day. Yalta head. Really? Really? After what I just said about the bathroom?
It's like she's having a breakdown. But it's hysterical. It's amazing.
The 50s and 60s. A time when $20 was a lot of money, everyone had impeccable fashion sense, and it was easy to just get out there and make a living on your own terms. Somewhat. It wasn't exactly smooth sailing for comedians around then, if you were even lucky to make a name for yourself. And if you were a woman, any career you had most likely ended either when you got married or when you had kids. It took guts for a woman to pursue a career of her own, and if that career just so happened to be in stand-up comedy, she'd have to be a special kind of crazy. And that's exactly what The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel is about. It's a period comedy and drama about a woman trying to do the impossible, make a name for herself in a brutal, cutthroat industry, and during a time when society itself doesn't believe in her.
Men, those over there, and men in general, think that they are the only ones who get to use comedy to close up those holes in their soul. They run around telling everyone that women aren't funny.
If you've been keeping tabs on current TV trends, there's a good chance you've at least heard of this show. It's by no means an underrated gem. Every season so far is very well regarded, and it's won many awards for its writing, directing, and its incredibly talented cast. But as any sensible person will tell you, numbers and accolades don't tell the whole story. It's apparent that the show is very good, but it's not obvious why it's so good.
Oh, come on.
A period dramedy about a female comedian is a unique premise, but it's also not the kind that immediately draws you in. Especially when its competition includes vampire mockumentaries, podcasting murder mysteries, and darker interpretations of superheroes. Just to name a few. But make no mistake, not only is the show just as good as every series I just mentioned, but in a lot of ways, it's even better. And if you're someone who's worried about spoilers, you can rest easy. The only major plot points I'll mention will be the ones in the first few episodes. Everything else will be kept to a minimum. And as you'll see, this isn't the kind of show that's reliant on twists and turns in the first place. The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel is very much about the journey, not the destinations, and you owe it to yourself to give it a chance.
My name is Mrs. Maisel. Thank you and good night!
Before getting into The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, we have to talk about its older, more famous sibling, Gilmore Girls. It was an early 2000s dramedy created by Amy-Sherman Palladino, the same person who would go on to create the short-lived series Bunheads, and later, The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. All three series share the same basic DNA, and a lot of what makes them so good can be seen in their oldest sibling. Gilmore Girls was a show about the titular Gilmore girls, Lorelai Gilmore and her daughter, Lorelai, better known as Rory. As for the plot of Gilmore Girls, well, it didn't really have one. It was a story about a single mother trying to raise a teenage daughter, and all the struggles that came with it. Like Lorelai balancing a work life with a personal life, Rory struggled to get into college, and romance melodrama. A lot of romance melodrama. While every season did have overarching storylines, it was really just a show about the life and times of these characters, as mundane or melodramatic it can be. To most people, the show looks and sounds kind of boring, and in many ways, it is. It wasn't the flashiest show out there, and it didn't have the most compelling kind of story. But Gilmore Girls was a massive success. The show ran for 7 years, and was so popular, it had enough of a following to get a revival almost 10 years after its original ending. Gilmore Girls succeeded because of two simple things: its witty, rapid-fire dialogue, and the strength of its characters. While the show's storylines move very slowly, the actual dialogue is almost the complete opposite. The show's tagline was "Life short, talk fast," and you can feel that throughout the entire show. Just see for yourself.
Something beautiful about them, though. They're cool, they're free.
Yeah, and they're memorable. Most people are very forgettable, and they're happy.
They had their cats.
And they're raccoons.
They're
doing yoga in the aisles, wearing cashmere sweatpants while your comfort dog watches Zoolander 2 on his watch.
I do blood clot prevention foot pumps wearing my Yonashimo Kanishiri baseball cap.
Arrested Development and Community are often considered some of the densest comedies of all time, but in terms of sheer writing density, they have nothing on Gilmore Girls. The average script of an hour-long TV show is roughly 40 to 50 pages, but for Gilmore Girls, the average script was almost double that, at around 80 pages in length. The dialogue was so intense that the lead actors quit smoking in order to keep up, and by season 3, the production team hired a dialogue coach to help the cast with their delivery. It was an insane amount of work from everyone involved, but it was well worth it. The normal conversations felt more vibrant, punchlines were set up or delivered, and characters that seem muted feel more lively and colorful. The same kind of scenes that are lambasted nowadays are where Gilmore Girls truly shined. And as great as the dialogue was, it was only one half of the formula. As a slice of life series, Gilmore Girls is driven entirely by its characters. And throughout the series, we really got to know them. They could be funny or weird, they grew and changed, and they made mistakes.
Rory stole a yacht. How's your night been?
What?
And while this applies to the main characters, the same principle applies to almost every character in the show. Good characters evolved into great characters, and even the dirtbags did some good. While Gilmore Girls revolved around Lorelai and Rory, everyone in Stars Hollow, Yale, and beyond mattered just as much. Now, Gilmore Girls was far from perfect. Trust me, we'll get to that. But it was very honest. It wore its heart on its sleeve and made the most out of what was available. The witty repartee elevated the ordinary mundanity, and every character felt just a little more human, like the kind of people you or I might have known at some point. So imagine what would happen if you took the winning formula in Gilmore Girls and made it even better. To most onlookers, Midge Maisel has it all. She married her college sweetheart shortly after graduating, she's a proud mother of 2, and she can make one hell of a brisket. She's a shining example of the ideal 1950s American woman. Until one night, her husband drops a bombshell on her.
I've been having an affair.
When your entire life revolves around being a good wife and mother, it's the worst thing you could ever hear. And to add insult to injury, when she turns to her parents for support, the first thing they assume is that it's her fault.
Joel left you?
Yes.
Why? What did you do?
It's totally unfair, and all they do is make an awful night even worse. So, with a bottle of wine in hand, Midge does about the only thing any normal person would have done. Get out there and bend to complete strangers.
And I'm officially losing my mind, which is perfect. Now I will be alone and crazy. The famous mad divorcee of the Upper West Side.
And people love it. So much that one of the audience members sees Midge's potential. She's a little rough around the edges, but she's got the moxie and talent to go the distance. And with enough time and effort, she could be a star. At its core, The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel is an underdog story. It's about a woman taking back her life when all the odds are stacked against her. Her career path is risky and volatile, and there's a real chance she'll never achieve any kind of success. But even if she does crash and burn, at least she did it her way. Much of the show revolves around Midge's new career, like making the right connections, booking gigs, and refining her unique brand of comedy.
Good afternoon. How may I help you?
Yes, I want something that'll make my wife look like...
Elizabeth Taylor. So I asked for all the money in his wallet and said, there, now at least it'll feel like you're married to Elizabeth Taylor.
But while she has the talent, she needs more than talent alone to succeed. Everyone in showbiz is fighting for the spotlight as well, and while many are happy to lend her a hand, others aren't quite so noble. And as someone from a life of luxury and privilege, Midge has a lot to learn about this industry. But while Midge's stand-up career is the overarching story, the other focus are all the subplots throughout the show. Part of Midge's stand-up routine consists of talking about her personal life, which opens the door for a whole new set of problems. The only person aware of Midge's career is her manager, but there's no telling what would happen if anyone else found out. Like her ex-husband, who once upon a time dreamt of being a comedian just like her.
Holes. Holes in my sweater.
Or her parents, who are as old school and traditional as they come. They already berate Midge for cursing like a sailor, and that's filtered Midge. Imagine their reaction to her stand-up routine. This series balances the bigger overarching storylines with the small-scale personal ones, and as the story continues, the line between the two becomes blurrier and blurrier. But as engaging as the show's plotlines can be, they aren't really the main focus. In fact, many episodes won't advance the main plots at all. That's because, like Gilmore Girls, The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel is a character-driven show. There's less focus on what's happening, and more focus on how it's happening, why it's happening, and who it's happening to. While the show is centered around Midge, it isn't just her story. This series quickly becomes an ensemble dramedy, with every character having some kind of role to play. And they're all brimming with personality. The colorful cast of Gilmore Girls is one of its greatest strengths, and I'd say the exact same thing about this show. While many of them seem a little one-note at first, as the series goes on, it becomes apparent that couldn't be further from the truth. Midge is obviously one of the best examples of this, as someone who's introduced as the ideal American housewife, but later says the kind of things that would make a rabbi faint.
And whatever you heard, people, I did not Father O'Brien.
But this trend applies to almost every character in the show. Susie is Midge's manager and partner in crime, and when things get dicey, she's the one who steps up and gets her hands dirty.
You borrow us from clubs, I get us back in those clubs. You put up walls, I tear them down. You threaten her, you threaten me.
At the same time, she's deathly afraid of flying, likes gambling a little too much, and doesn't know how to swim. She's learning though.
I won't let you go!
Water up the nose, I got water up my nose!
Then we have the rigid, traditional Wisemans. But even though they look down on their daughter's antics, the apple doesn't fall that far from the tree.
Okay, you want to come too?
Even Joel, Midge's ex-husband and resident garbage bag, has moments where you can't help but feel for the guy. The character writing is sublime, but it's the sort of thing that's not obvious at first glance. A trailer or plot summary will give you the bigger picture, but this is a show that thrives on the details. A trailer isn't going to tell you how the prim and proper Rose Wiseman is really into fortune-telling and is actually a huge French geek. A weeaboo, if you will.
You're in Paris. Take it in. Internalize it.
Gugère, French cheese puffs. Oh, te voilà, Simone. Je me demandais bien quand tu voudrais ton déjeuner.
Or how Abe uses miniatures to plan his trips, has a very particular vacation routine he tries to keep secret, and is an actual grammar Nazi.
What are you doing? Are you correcting it?
Apostrophe S. We are fighting against fascism, not punctuation.
They're all extremely well-rounded, complete with fun, likable qualities, as well as deep-seated personal flaws that affect everyone around them. And these are just the little things. Not only are all the characters very well-rounded, but almost everyone gets some sort of progression throughout the show. For example, Joel's arc revolves around stepping out of his parents' shadow and becoming his own man, all while doing his best to provide for his children. He may have started the series with an awful mistake, but he's been on a road to redemption ever since.
A couple of drinks for a couple of girls, that's it. You're making a mistake.
Oh my God.
You should listen to me, I'm doing you a favor.
Susie's arc involves learning how to be a manager, businesswoman, and friend. And in showbiz, those roles don't always mix very well. Then there's Abe, who begins looking for the spark and ambition of his yesteryears, which ends up taking him into some weird places.
What is happening?
I don't know, I think they're breeding.
And just like her daughter, Rose eventually gains the confidence to stand up for herself and take back control of her life. Every character in the show gets something worthwhile, and I do mean every character. Gag characters grow and change, supporting characters get their own arcs, and recurring characters have so much charm and charisma, they steal every scene they're in. This is the kind of show that will flesh out inanimate objects, and straight up, that plunger has way more personality than actual people I've known. All the characters are weird and messy, but dynamic, and a big part of the show is watching what kind of journeys they go on, whether it's for the better or for the worse.
Susie, please, I've got a lot of flammable products in my hair. We'll die if we just stand here.
We'll die on stage! What a way to go!
Move.
Now, having said all that, the plot lines and character writing aren't the only main draws. The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel has one final ace up its sleeve, and it's what sets it apart from every show out there. Pure, unadulterated pageantry. The witty back and forth from Gilmore Girls makes a return, and it's just as energetic and funny as it was before. And in many ways, it's even better.
Just because it's not wrapped in a pink box like some party cake doesn't make it garbage.
Why didn't you bring a suitcase?
I don't have one.
What do you use for vacations?
My imagination?
I've made precisely scaled models.
Your little toys.
They're not toys.
They're cute.
They're cute, yes, but they're not toys. And
I am very famous and important.
Yes, we were talking about me, remember?
I do. What are you doing tonight?
Listening to you critique my act.
But the dialogue is only an accessory compared to the show's real standout quality, the cinematography. If you've watched any movie or TV show, chances are you're familiar with long takes. As the name implies, they're those long, continuous shots where an entire scene plays out without cuts or interruption. They require incredible skill in directing, but the final result is well worth it. When used effectively, they elevate entire scenes with just visuals alone. The tension feels palpable, you can see the electricity in the air, and any emotional sequences hit even harder. Long takes are so revered that movies like 1917 use them as a main draw, and shows like Mr. Robot build entire episodes around them. Long takes are normally rare since they're so tricky to pull off, but for the Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, it's the bread and butter filming technique. Without fail, every single episode features not one, but several long takes, giving the series a cinematic flair you won't see anywhere else. Normal scenes feel dynamic and theatrical, and the spectacles look even more spectacular. Now, long takes were actually a staple in both Gilmore Girls and Bunheads, but considering both shows took place in sleepy American towns, they weren't exactly jaw-dropping. And that is not the case here. 1950s New York is vibrant and colorful, and while the show begins in New York, it doesn't stay there for long. This show is a globe-trotting adventure, with each location bringing its own style and flair. If you're someone who loves the art of filmmaking, you owe it to yourself to watch a few episodes for the visuals alone. And if you're willing to stick around for the long haul, all the better. The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel oozes style, and the real magic of the show is watching how it all works together in harmony. You have incredible production design and stylish cinematography, all strung together with witty dialogue and fantastically written characters. As Carl Weathers likes to say, baby, you've got a stew going. It's truly a thing of beauty, and it's something you should experience for yourself. Now, as much as I'd like to just leave it at that and call it a day, it's only fair to bring up where the show struggles. It doesn't have that many weak points, and as we'll see, they're not so much flaws, and more like points for your consideration. Many fans, myself included, don't really mind some parts of the show. A lot of it will come down to your personal preference. While the show thrives on spectacle and pageantry, there are times when it veers on being too much of a good thing. The first season is fairly restrained, but as the show continues, the pageantry starts to border on overindulgence. There are these long, extended performances, and they rarely move the story forward or add new insight into any of the characters. It's charming at first, and scenes like this give the series its unique sense of style, but they don't help when you combine it with the next point, the pacing. I mentioned earlier how there are times when the main plot will take a backseat in favor of small-scale shenanigans. And this isn't a bug, it's a feature. Gilmore Girls and Bunheads never had much in terms of plot, and any storylines it did have moved at a glacial pace. Mrs. Maisel has a much stronger plot than either of its kin, but it doesn't move that much faster. And I don't think this is actually a bad thing. A brisk pace works for plot-driven stories because you want to keep the story moving. But character-driven stories are almost the opposite. They live and die by your attachment to the cast, and you need ample time to get invested in the characters. The more time you spend with them, the better you get to know them, and the better you get to know them, the easier it is to care about what's happening to them.
Well, that was fun.
If you find the characters charming, likable, or interesting, chances are you're not going to mind all these meandering misadventures. But if you're more interested in the ongoing story of Midge's career, then parts of the show might get frustrating. It's very easy to be drawn into what's going on with Midge, only for the show to pivot to a side story, another character, or an extended musical performance, all of which kill any momentum that's been building so far. Even as someone who loves the show, I fully admit it can be annoying sometimes. It's a judgment call you have to make for yourself. And that gets into the final overarching issue, the characters. While I praise the character writing in the show, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. The show gives you many reasons to like every character, but it also gives you just as many to despise them. Especially Midge. She's the kind of character that's easy to root for, but at the same time, she's self-absorbed, lacks empathy, has a big mouth, and a bigger ego. That's a dangerous combination for any career, let alone one where you go on stage and talk about your personal life. She's an amazing character, but if you put a paintball gun to my head and asked me if she was a good person, I'd probably just say pull the trigger. It's kind of hard to enjoy a character-driven show if you don't like the characters, or at the bare minimum, find them interesting. If you can't stand Midge, or any of the other characters, then the show is going to feel insufferable. Again, this is going to come down to your personal preference. Flawed characters make for a much better story, but everyone has a limit on how much they can tolerate. As weird as it is to say, this show is a lot more Breaking Bad than Ted Lasso at times, which isn't the sort of thing you'd expect from a period dramedy. As for the other downsides, well, there aren't that many. The show has other issues, some minor and some not so minor, but the reality is that it's not finished. As of now, there's only 3 seasons released, with the 4th just over the horizon. Finally! Yes! Because the show isn't finished, it wouldn't be fair to label everything as a strict flaw. Yet. This show could run into a similar scenario like Mr. Robot, where one season feels like a mess, but in hindsight, it's actually not that bad. Mr. Robot's 2nd season caused a lot of people to drop the show, myself included. But a big reason why the later seasons were so good was because season 2 laid the groundwork first. So instead of labeling the next 3 topics as flaws, think of them more like warning signs. If you've been through one train wreck, you can sense when another one's coming. Earlier, I mentioned how Mrs. Maisel shares a lot in common with Gilmore Girls, and that's not necessarily a compliment. If there's one thing Gilmore Girls was notorious for, it was how it handled romance. The romantic entanglements of the Gilmores made up a majority of the show's storylines, whether as the constant back and forth of Luke and Lorelai, or Rory's army of teenage dreamboats. And while all of that was fine, the real problem was how ridiculous it got.
Rory is my daughter and Lorelai's daughter, and that's it!
Well, I'm with Lorelai.
For now.
Love triangles, broken engagements, surprise eloping, surprise divorce. You get the idea. It was a mess, and it made the series a complete chore to watch. Everything would be going fine, until something, or someone, shows up to cause drama. Sometimes it felt natural, but many times it didn't. It's the kind of storytelling that just gets exhausting after a while. And without getting into it too much, The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel has the same problem. Romance isn't as big a focus, but it's still fairly relevant. And just like Gilmore Girls, many of them are very well written, until surprise surprise, something goes wrong. This is especially apparent with Midge and Joel, which is the closest thing the show has to a main romance. These two go back and forth so often that they're gonna get whiplash at some point. It feels like the show doesn't even know what to do with them sometimes. It could honestly go either way. Obviously, if you're someone who's really into romance drama, this won't bother you at all. It might even be a positive. But if you're someone who gets really into shipping, take it from someone who's been down this road before. You might want to temper your expectations. ASP just seems allergic to relationships. The moment things are going well, you can bet that some drama is already on the way. Just to put things into perspective, Luke and Lorelai were the main romance of Gilmore Girls, and that didn't get a proper resolution until the revival 9 years later. Not to mention the relationships that are still unresolved, and will most likely stay that way for the foreseeable future. I don't think Mrs. Maisel will get that bad, but it's already doing the same song and dance. Fingers crossed it doesn't make the same mistakes. And for the final issue, we have to circle back to Gilmore Girls one last time. As I mentioned earlier, the series ran for 7 years, but what I didn't mention was how the series slowly died over those years. Gilmore Girls suffered from many issues during its run, like the aforementioned relationship drama, and later, character assassination. But they're symptoms of an issue plaguing the series from the very beginning: stagnation. Gilmore Girls was a show that never really had a direction. There was no overarching goal, no big problem that needed to be solved, and it didn't have a natural endpoint. It was a slice of life series that could theoretically go on forever. And while that sounds good on paper, the problem is that writers only have so much creativity in the well. The story always needs some kind of conflict, and with every season that passed, the creativity well ran drier and drier, forcing the writers to find new ways to create said conflict. And by the later seasons and the revival, it showed. Like characters having secret kids, reigniting old flames over and over, and Rory's spiral of self-destruction that includes dropping out of Yale, a felony, and not one, but 2 affairs. Gilmore Girls was littered with shaky writing, and when it got revived almost a decade later, it ended so badly that many fans wished it never came back in the first place.
Mom?
Yeah.
I'm pregnant.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
ASP is an excellent character and dialogue writer, but her skills as a storyteller are a very mixed bag, bordering on non-existent. It's one of the factors that led to the slow death of Gilmore Girls, and probably one of the factors that led to the premature death of Bunheads. The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel is her most story-focused show yet, and while it's wonderful now, the longer it goes on, the less likely it will stay that way. Setbacks are a natural, if not expected part of Midge's career, but the show can't sustain itself by moving 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. The story already moves fairly slowly, and if it continues at its current rate, it runs the risk of stagnating over time. And unlike Gilmore Girls, this isn't the kind of show that can go on forever. There's no word on how long the show is going to be, but I'd say it has about 2 more solid seasons left in it. Maybe 3 if we're being optimistic. Any more after that, and it runs the risk of Silicon Valley Syndrome, also known as the Handmaid's Tale effect. What I mean by this is when the characters are hit with a setback that's so brutal, it boots them all the way back to square one. But they shrug it off, and with more resolve than ever, they swear that next time, things are going to be different. The first time, it's fine. It'd be a little boring if everything went too smoothly. The second time, it's tolerable. But the third time and beyond, it's downright annoying.
You don't think this had anything to do with us, do you?
If you've watched Silicon Valley or The Handmaid's Tale, then you know how frustrating and repetitive it is. The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel hasn't reached that point yet, but it only takes a string of weak episodes or a lackluster season to get there. This show's saving grace is that unlike its predecessors, it actually has a plot. There's a lot of ways this story could still evolve. New characters, more historical figures, or storylines after Midge's success. And in the end, a lot of the segment is total conjecture. Many of the issues I pointed out either come down to personal preference, or aren't legitimate issues. At least not yet, and I hope it stays that way. Season 4 is just around the corner, and by the time it's finished, we'll have a better idea of where the show's going. And with the new season on the way, there's no better time to check out The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. Beneath all the style and all the pageantry, it's the kind of story that will resonate with a lot of people. I'm sure we can all relate to having our lives blown up by things outside our control, the crushing realization that our futures didn't go as planned, or the fear and uncertainty of massive, life-changing decisions. It's a story about people forging their own destiny, and during a time that for many, it was only a pipe dream. It's definitely not for everyone, but hopefully, there's something in here for you. I've said it before, and I'll say it one last time. The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel is one of the best shows on TV right now. It might not stay that way, but there's nothing else quite like it. It's simply marvelous.
It's up.